81 people have been executed in Alabama. This is part 5 of the series. Christopher Eugene Brooks, January 21, 2016, lethal injection. Brooks, aged 43, was convicted for the December 1992 essay and murder of 23-year-old Joe Dean Campbell. Investigators connected him to the crime through DNA and fingerprint evidence, as well as Campbell's vehicle and several items stolen from her Homewood apartment, including a credit card he had used. Campbell's partially clothed body was discovered under her bed, and she had been bludgeoned with a barbell. The two had first met in upstate New York in 1991 when both worked at different camps in Adirondack Mountains. According to Campbell's family, they were not romantically involved, and she was surprised when Brooks appeared at the Chili's restaurant where she worked as a training manager on December 30, 1992. She reportedly told a friend that she planned to let Brooks and one of his friends sleep on her floor that night. Brooks maintained his innocence. The friend was initially charged as well, but later had his capital murder charge dropped after passing a polygraph test and because investigators found no forensic evidence linking him to the crime. He eventually pled guilty to a credit card fraud charge instead. According to Alabama prison spokesman Bob Horton, Brooks' final day followed a structured schedule. At 6:10 a.m., he was given a breakfast of grits, a biscuit, sausage, jelly, and cheese, though he chose not to eat it. He met with two friends at 8:40 a.m., followed by a meeting with his spiritual advisor at 9:50 a.m. Later, at 2:24 p.m., he met with his attorneys until 4:15 p.m. For his last meal, Brooks requested 2 peanut butter cups and a Dr. Pepper, which he did consume. When he was brought into the execution chamber, the curtain opened for witnesses at 6:06 p.m. and closed at 6:30 p.m. His death was pronounced at 6:38 p.m. A prison chaplain stood beside him, holding his hand and praying as the sedative was administered. Brooks's eyes closed, his mouth fell open, and his breathing gradually slowed until no movement was visible by 6:19 p.m. In his final words, Brooks said, "I hope this brings closure to everybody." Turning to the two friends, his spiritual advisor and his lawyers who were present, he added that they were a godsend and that he would take them with him in his heart. His last words were, "I'll see you soon. Bye. I love y'all." Ronald Burt Smith Jr., December 8, 2016, lethal injection. Smith was found guilty of capital murder for the killing of a store clerk during a robbery. In the November 1994 incident, the jury voted 7-5 in favor of sentencing him to life in prison. However, the presiding judge overturned that recommendation and imposed the death penalty instead. The victim, Huntsville store employee Casey Wilson, was pistol whipped and shot in the head during the course of the robbery. Surveillance footage captured Smith entering the store and retrieving the spent shell casings from the area where Wilson had been shot. Ronald Burt Smith Jr., 45, was pronounced dead more than 30 minutes after the lethal injection procedure began at the state prison. The execution used the 3-drug protocol, starting with the sedative midazolam, a substance Smith had previously challenged in court, arguing that it could leave inmates conscious and in pain during the process. As the drugs were administered, witnesses reported that Smith began coughing and gasping, clenched his fists, and lifted his head off the gurney. Officials conducted 2 separate consciousness checks before proceeding with the final 2 injections. During the first check, Smith moved his arm. During the second, he again lifted it and at one point appeared to open one of his eyes. Before his execution, Smith spent time with his mother, father, son, and 4 close friends. For his final meal, he requested 3 pieces of fried chicken accompanied by French fries, but he chose to skip breakfast that morning. He didn't have any last words. Thomas Douglas Arthur, May 26, 2017, lethal injection. On the morning of February 1, 1982, at approximately 9:12 a.m., police officers in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, responded to a call at the home of Mary Jewel Judy Wicker and her husband, Troy Wicker. When officers entered the residence, they discovered a gruesome scene. Troy Wicker was dead in his bed, having been shot, while his wife, Judy, lay on the floor with traces of blood on her face. Her sister, Teresa Rowland, was found kneeling beside her. Investigators recovered 4 spent .22 caliber cartridge casings from the bed. An autopsy later determined that Troy had been killed by a close-range gunshot to his right eye from a .22 caliber long rifle. The bullet had passed through his brainstem, causing instant death. When questioned, Judy Wicker told police that she had dropped her children off at school earlier that morning and returned home to find an African American man inside. She claimed the intruder essayed her, knocked her unconscious, and shot her husband before fleeing the scene. However, this story soon unraveled. Wicker was charged and later convicted of her husband's murder, with prosecutors arguing that she had orchestrated the killing to collect life insurance proceeds. She received a life sentence. Years later, after her conviction, the district attorney approached the parole board to explore the possibility of releasing Wicker early in exchange for her testimony against another suspect, Thomas Arthur. Wicker's daughter, Tina Jenkins, hired attorney Gary Alverson to represent her interests in that meeting. Ironically, Alverson later became a state prosecutor, and in 1991, he represented the state during Arthur's trial for Troy Wicker's murder. During that trial, Judy Wicker took the stand as the prosecution's key witness. She testified that she had known Arthur for years. They had worked together at Tidwell Homes, and revealed that she, her sister Teresa Rowland, and Rowland's boyfriend Theron McKinney had begun discussing plans to kill Troy as early as 1981. According to her account, Troy was abusive and frequently fought with Rowland, particularly after he threatened to expose her to police for an arson he had committed on her behalf. Wicker stated that in November 1981, she received a phone call from Arthur, who told her he had been hired to do the job to kill her husband. A week later, they met in person and began an affair. At that time, Arthur was living at the Decatur Work Release Center and working at Regan Mobile Homes. Wicker testified that she was fully aware the murder would take place on February 1, 1982, and that she had agreed to stage a fake burglary and claim her husband had been killed by a black intruder. On the morning of the murder, she met Rowland and Arthur at the local airport. Arthur, who had been drinking, was armed with a gun and carrying a garbage bag. He had disguised himself by painting his face black and wearing an afro wig and black gloves. Wicker said she drove him to her home, begging him along the way to not go through with the murder. Once inside the house, she heard a gunshot. Arthur then attacked her, knocking out several of her teeth and splitting her lip to make her injuries appear consistent with her fabricated story. After Troy's death, Judy Wicker collected $90,000 in life insurance proceeds. She admitted that she paid Arthur $10,000 for committing the murder, gave her sister Rowland $6,000, and rewarded McKinney with jewelry and a car for helping plan the crime. Wicker also confessed that she continued her affair with Arthur even after her husband's murder. Her detailed testimony was supported by other witnesses and corroborating evidence, ultimately helping secure Arthur's conviction. Arthur declined to have a last meal before his execution. He didn't have any last words. Robert Bryant Melson, June 8, 2017, lethal injection. Melson was executed by lethal injection for his role in the 1994 murders of 3 employees at a fast food restaurant in Gadsden. Together with an accomplice who had previously worked there, Melson carried out an armed robbery at a Popeyes located about 60 miles northeast of Birmingham. During the course of the robbery, Melson forced 4 employees into the restaurant freezer and opened fire, killing Nathaniel Baker, Tamika Collins, and Darrell Collier. One employee, Bryant Archer, survived the attack by crawling out of the freezer to seek help. Archer later identified one of the assailants as a former Popeyes employee, which ultimately led investigators to Melson and his arrest. When asked if he wished to make a final statement, Melson silently shook his head, indicating no. As the execution began at around 9:59 p.m., witnesses noted that his hands trembled. For the first several minutes, roughly 7 in total, Melson's breathing appeared somewhat strained. Gradually, his breaths became slower and less noticeable. When a corrections officer performed the required consciousness check, Melson gave no response. The second and third drugs in the 3-drug protocol, those intended to halt the heart and breathing, were then administered. He declined both his breakfast and his final meal. Tory Twain McNabb, October 19, 2017, lethal injection. McNabb was executed for the 1997 murder of Montgomery police officer Anderson Gordon. McNabb had caused a traffic accident while fleeing from a bail bondsman, and when Officer Gordon arrived at the scene, McNabb opened fire, shooting him 5 times as he sat in his patrol car. When the execution began, McNabb, 40, displayed open defiance. He raised both middle fingers and shouted, "I hate you," directing his final words toward the state. As the lethal injection process continued, witnesses observed him breathing for approximately 20 minutes of the 35-minute-long procedure. He appeared to move his head, grimace, and lift his arms, even after two consciousness checks performed by a guard who called his name, pinched his arm, and pulled back his eyelid before finally becoming still. His family members and attorneys present in the witness room whispered anxiously to one another, convinced that McNabb remained conscious. "He's going to wake up," one of his relatives murmured. McNabb ultimately was pronounced dead at 9:38 p.m. He declined his last meal prior to the execution. Michael Wayne Eggers, March 15, 2018, lethal injection. In 2002, Eggers was convicted of capital murder for the brutal killing of 67-year-old Benny Francis Murray, a woman who had once been his employer and had gone out of her way to help him. Despite her generosity and the time she dedicated to assisting him in finding a new job, Eggers repaid her kindness with shocking cruelty. On the night of her death, Mrs. Murray had given him a ride so he could retrieve his car. Instead of thanking her, Eggers viciously beat and strangled her, then later returned to the scene to ensure she was dead. Years later, in 2016, Eggers expressed a desire to hasten his own execution and dismissed his attorneys from the Federal Public Defender's office in Montgomery. His execution began at 6:54 p.m. when the curtain to the 3 viewing rooms was drawn open. The warden read the death warrant aloud before asking Eggers if he had any final words. He simply responded, "No, ma'am." At 6:56 p.m., Eggers raised his hand and gave a thumbs-up gesture toward the viewing room where his brother, sister-in-law, two friends, and spiritual advisor were seated alongside several members of the press. One of the men in the group returned the gesture, signing "I love you" in sign language. By 7 p.m., Eggers' breathing became noticeably heavy. 3 minutes later, a corrections officer conducted a consciousness check, calling out "Inmate Eggers" 3 times while brushing his eyelid and pinching his arm. Eggers' arm twitched slightly in response. His breathing gradually slowed, and at 7:09 p.m., a second consciousness check was performed, during which he made no movement. At 7:12 p.m., witnesses observed his breathing stop entirely. The viewing room curtains were closed at 7:22 p.m., and at 7:29 p.m., Alabama Department of Corrections spokesman Bob Horton confirmed that Eggers had been pronounced dead. For his final meal, Eggers did not request anything special, and instead he ate the same meal served to the general prison population: chicken Creole, dirty rice, turnip greens, cornbread, creamed corn, cake, and a grape drink. Earlier that morning, he had eaten breakfast consisting of eggs, grits, prunes, and 2 biscuits with gravy. Walter Leroy Moody Jr., April 19, 2018, lethal injection. On May 7, 1972, Hazel Moody, the wife of Walter Leroy Moody, discovered a package in their kitchen that turned out to be a homemade pipe bomb. The device exploded in front of her, severely injuring her hand, thigh, and shoulder, and sending fragments of metal into one of her eyes. She required 6 surgeries to treat the injuries. Moody was charged with constructing the bomb with the intent of sending it to a car dealer who had repossessed his car. On October 19, 1972, he was acquitted of the charge of making the bomb, but he was convicted of possessing it, receiving a 5-year sentence at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Shortly after his conviction, Moody and his wife divorced. On December 16, 1989, federal judge Robert Vance was killed at his Mountain Brook, Alabama residence when he opened a package containing a homemade pipe bomb, which detonated immediately. His wife Helen survived but sustained severe injuries. After a detailed investigation, authorities arrested Moody and his second wife, Susan McBride, on July 13, 1990. McBride was quickly released on a $250,000 bail and later cooperated with prosecutors, testifying against Moody in exchange for immunity. Moody faced federal charges for the murder of Judge Vance and for the killing of Robert Robinson, a black civil rights attorney in Savannah, Georgia, who was killed 2 days later when a bomb exploded at his office on December 18, 1989. Additional charges included sending explosive devices that were intercepted and safely defused at the 11th Circuit Court headquarters in Atlanta and at the Jacksonville, Florida office of member Willie Dennis. Louis J. Free, the lead prosecutor under Robert Mueller, explained that the bombings were intended as diversions to mislead investigators. Moody's motivations for killing Vance and targeting the court stemmed from his anger over the judiciary's refusal to overturn his 1972 conviction for the earlier home explosion, despite Vance having no involvement in that prior decision. At 83 years and 26 days old at the time of his execution, Moody became the oldest person executed in the U.S. since the post-Furman era, surpassing the previous record held by John Nixon Sr., who was executed in Mississippi in December 2005 at 77 years and 8 months. Moody chose not to make a final statement, and his last meal consisted of Philly cheesesteaks, a Dr. Pepper, and M&Ms. Dominic Hakim Marcel Ray, February 7, 2019, lethal injection. In February 1994, Ray fatally shot brothers Reinhard and Ernest Mabens after they declined to join a gang he led. On July 15, 1995, Ray and an accomplice abducted 15-year-old Tiffany Harville from her Selma, Alabama home. According to trial testimony, Ray essayed and murdered Harville, cutting her throat with a knife. Her body was discovered in a Dallas County field a month after she went missing. In 1999, both Ray and his accomplice were convicted. Ray's accomplice received a life sentence, while Ray was sentenced to death after jurors voted 11-1 in favor of the death penalty. Ray declined the final meal. His final words were spoken in Arabic. As he prepared to speak, he made a distinct hand gesture, a closed fist with his index finger extended. His gaze was directed toward the viewing room, where two of his attorneys and his spiritual advisor were present, along with several members of the media. Ray raised his head and glanced at his arm a few minutes after the execution started. He did not react when a correctional officer checked his consciousness a few minutes later. While he did not accept the evening meal, he did eat the regular breakfast served earlier in the day, which consisted of eggs, milk, potatoes, 2 biscuits, jelly, and prunes. Michael Brandon Samra, May 16, 2019, lethal injection. At the time of the crime, Samra was 19 years old, and he had been drawn into the offense by a 16-year-old friend, Mark Duke. Duke, reportedly furious that his father, Randy Duke, refused to allow him to use his pickup truck, became the instigator of the violent events. According to court records, Samra and Duke, both armed, confronted Randy at his residence. Present in the home at the time were Randy's girlfriend, Dedra Mims Hunt, and her young daughters, Chalisa and Chelsea. During the attack, Mark Duke shot his father first and then chased Hunt and the 2 girls through the house, ultimately killing the mother and Chalisa. Samra was found guilty of murdering Chelsea by slitting her throat. Initially, both Samra and Duke were sentenced to death, but Duke's sentence was later overturned after the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty could not be imposed on individuals who were under 18 at the time they committed their crimes. Prison officials reported that Samra chose to forgo breakfast and did not request a final meal or any other last-minute accommodations. His execution was originally scheduled for 6 p.m., but it began over an hour later at 7:09 p.m. A physician officially pronounced him dead at 7:33 p.m. When asked if he wished to make any final statements, Samra offered a prayer. I would like to thank Jesus for everything he's done for me. I want to thank Jesus for shedding his blood for my sins. Thank you for your grace, Jesus. Amen. For several minutes, Samra remained alert before his eyes slowly closed. At 7:15 p.m., his chest moved sharply 3 times in quick succession. Following this, his breathing became noticeably labored, with his head making slight jerking motions with each inhalation over the next minute. At 7:17 p.m., a consciousness test was administered. 2 minutes later, Samra extended his fingers outward, attempting to lift his left hand against the wrist restraints before curling his fingers inward. After this movement, he became still. Christopher Lee Price, May 30, 2019, lethal injection. Price was sentenced to death for the 1991 killing of Fayette County preacher Bill Lynn. At the time, Price was 19 years old when he and an accomplice approached Lynn outside his Bazemore residence just 3 days before Christmas. The 2 assailants attacked Lynn while he was inspecting the power box. Lynn's wife, Bessie, later testified that the intruders had also beaten her before ransacking their home, stealing jewelry and money. Prosecutors reported that Bill Lynn suffered 38 cuts and stab wounds inflicted with a sword and a dagger. He succumbed to his injuries approximately 45 minutes after being taken to the hospital. In 1993, a Fayette County jury sentenced Price to death, voting 10-2 in favor of capital punishment. Price later sought to challenge his sentence, claiming that his trial attorney had been unprepared for the penalty phase. He argued that his lawyer failed to present evidence showing that, as a teenager, he had endured severe psychological trauma from years of physical abuse and essay by his mother's boyfriends. In 2013, the Supreme Court declined to review his case. Kevin Coleman, who had participated in the attack alongside Price, pleaded guilty to murder and received a life sentence. In his last words, Price said, "A man is much more than his worst mistake." As the warden at Holman removed the microphone from his gurney, Price seemed to become emotional and unable to continue speaking. He muttered something that could not be clearly heard from the witness chamber. Price's last meal before his execution consisted of 4 pence of turtle pie ice cream, which he requested from the prison canteen. He declined breakfast on the day of his execution. Nathaniel Woods, March 5, 2020, lethal injection. The murders for which Woods was convicted occurred on June 17, 2004 in Birmingham, Alabama. On that day, 4 police officers, Harley Chisholm III, Charles Bennett, Carlos Owen, and Michael Collins, had a verbal encounter with Woods while attempting to serve an outstanding arrest warrant for another individual who was not present at a crack house on the 18th Street. At the time of the confrontation, Woods was inside the residence along with 4 others, Kerry Spencer, Fernando Belser, Marquita McClure, and Marquisha Williams. Following the encounter, the officers ran Woods' name through a police database, discovered that he himself had an outstanding warrant, and decided to return later that day to apprehend him. When the officers returned, only Woods and Spencer were inside the apartment. They entered the residence and pursued Woods, during which an officer deployed mace against him. According to Woods and Spencer, when the officers arrived, Spencer retrieved an SKS rifle while Woods was in the kitchen. After Woods surrendered to the officers, Spencer entered the room, saw 2 officers pointing firearms at him, and opened fire, killing 3 of the 4 officers, Chisholm, Bennett, and Owen, while Woods fled the apartment. Officer Collins was shot but survived the attack. The exact number of officers inside the apartment during the shooting was disputed. Collins claimed that only he, Owen, and Chisholm entered the apartment, while Bennett remained at the front door. As the 3 attempted to arrest Woods, Spencer allegedly appeared and fired at Collins, Owen, and Chisholm. Collins stated that he then heard Woods inform Spencer that another officer, Bennett, was at the front door, prompting Spencer to shoot Bennett as well. Following the shooting, Woods and Spencer fled to the home of their friend John Prather, where they hid until being arrested. Despite Woods not firing any shots, both he and Spencer were charged with the murders. Spencer consistently maintained that Woods was not involved, stating, "Nate is absolutely innocent. That man didn't know I was going to shoot anybody, just like I didn't know I was going to shoot anybody that day, period." For his last meal before his execution, Nathaniel Woods requested sweet potatoes, spinach, a chicken patty, a chicken leg quarter, cooked apples, fries, 2 oranges, and an orange-flavored drink. Woods ate only 1 bite of the chicken leg quarter and left the rest of the meal untouched. He had also refused breakfast on the morning of his execution. He did not make a final statement. Willie B. Smith, October 21, 2021, lethal injection. Smith was found guilty of the 1991 robbery and murder of 22-year-old Sharma Ruth Johnson. During the crime, he forced Johnson into the trunk of her own stolen vehicle and fatally shot her. Investigators reported that Smith then set the car on fire, leaving Johnson's body inside. Before his execution, Smith consumed snacks but declined full meals, according to Linda Mays, a spokeswoman for the Alabama Department of Corrections. He also met with an attorney and a spiritual advisor. Smith's legal team had requested a stay of his death sentence, arguing that the state had failed to provide him with an appropriate method to select death by nitrogen hypoxia in June 2018. They contended that Smith, who had intellectual disabilities, could not comprehend the opt-in form, and that the state had violated his rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act by not offering proper accommodations. All his appeals were denied, effectively ending his legal avenues. He had no last words. Matthew Reeves, January 27, 2022, lethal injection. On Wednesday, November 27, 1996, Reeves and several friends came up with a plan to rob a drug dealer. However, their scheme didn't unfold as intended. While in Selma, Alabama, Reeves's car broke down, leaving the group stranded. Willie Johnson Jr., a local man driving a pickup truck, offered to help by towing their disabled vehicle back to Reeves's house. Reeves rode in the bed of the truck as they made their way there. When they arrived, Reeves suddenly aimed a shotgun through the rear window of the truck's cab and shot Johnson, killing him instantly. Afterward, he took Johnson's money before fleeing. Later that same night, Reeves attended a party where witnesses said he mimicked the killing, pretending to cock a shotgun and jerking his body around in a grotesque imitation of the way Johnson had died. The next morning, Thanksgiving Day, Johnson's lifeless body was discovered inside his truck. Police arrested Reeves just a few hours after the murder at a nearby residence. Two other men who had been involved in the incident, including Reeves's brother, were captured several days later. Both accomplices told authorities that Reeves had pulled the trigger and was solely responsible for Johnson's death. At the time, Reeves was just 18 years old. On July 20, 1998, he was sentenced to death for his role in the murder. His brother and co-defendant, Julius Reeves, received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A third accomplice, Brenda Sattles, was given a life sentence as well, though she remained eligible for parole. Because of claims of intellectual disability, Reeves's execution was controversial to say the least. He was put to death at 44 years old. He had no last words and no last meal. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.